Hello everybody, welcome to today's BAInsights session. Today we'll be talking about requirements and reusable requirements. Okay, and I'm glad to have three excellent guests talk to us about that very topic, or both topics, if you will. Before we get into the detail, let's do some introductions. And perhaps if I could start with yourself first, Peter.
Thank you very much for having me. So, like you can see on the screen, my name is Peter Edemirukaye. I'm a business analyst. I've got a few years of experience, over half a decade, I'd say. I work with BlueLight Commercial, one of the BlueLight organization, or one of the frameworks that manages BlueLight organizations within the UK. So when you talk about policing, policy contracts, ambulance, and all of those BlueLight organizations you see around the UK. So BlueLight Commercial sort of provides that framework for them to undergo procurement and similar activities.
Excellent, thank you, Peter. Okay, and Chris?
Hi everyone, thank you for the invite along today. My name is Chris Coy. I work at Rolls-Royce, predominantly in the civil aerospace area. Been a lead BA for about 8 years now, and most of my experience is within the more of the waterfall delivery framework and within quite a heavily regulated industry, as you'd expect for aerospace.
Thanks a lot, Chris. And Lungile.
Good evening, and yes, it's evening on my side. Thank you very much for having me here, John. My name is Lungile, and I'm from South Africa, currently in Johannesburg. And yes, I've been a business analyst for a good just over 12 years now. And yeah, I've had a privilege of working in several countries doing business analysis work. So yes, I'm very much glad to be here.
Thank you very much. Likewise, and it's good, yeah, good to have you all on the session as well, I should say. So let's dive into the first question around requirements, definition, and reusable requirements. So, Peter, what are the key elements of a well-defined requirement from your perspective?
So, well-defined requirements. Well, that's a very nice question. I'll say, in today's world, I'll say it's kind of, it looks small from the surface, but when you look at it critically, it's sort of depth. So you must first understand what requirement is before you look at what are the key elements in it. So for me and my organization, we sort of use the waterfall, should I say, linear process of managing projects and activities. So first, before you understand the requirement, you must first understand what is the core purpose of that requirement. So this is where you look at the organization as a whole. So you tend to want to understand what is that objective of the organization, and it's from that objective then you begin to understand what sort of requirements you need to deliver those objectives. So from that perspective, you definitely want to know what is the requirement complete? Is it specific? Is it correct? Who is the owner of this requirement? Or what is the source of this requirement? So you want to try to define the requirement and document it in such a way that you can understand the source or where the requirement has come from. Is the requirement measurable? Because obviously when you're defining objectives, you want them to be measurable as well. So you want to try to ensure that that requirement is also measurable, just to make sure that it's streamlined to achieving a certain goal or objective.
Okay, good start there, Peter. I mean, you covered a lot of different subjects, I guess, or themes, I suppose, probably the right word for it. So talking about, you know, make sure there's common understanding, make sure your requirement can be measured, a couple of examples, making sure it's specific, and of course that context to try and understand before you get into the detail of the requirement, what is the scope of the project, what is it you're trying to achieve, what is the overall aspirations as well. So yeah, excellent start, Peter. I wonder, Chris, would you mind giving your perspective on that as well, please?
Yes, I sort of agree with a lot of the stuff Peter said. So generally we try and follow the SMART framework: specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. if memory serves correctly. I think quite often it is a lot harder to write requirements in that format than you perhaps think it's going to be when you set out to do it. But then from a capturing perspective, making sure they're all uniquely identifiable, making sure that there's a version control against those requirements, a prioritization against them, and an agreed way of prioritizing requirements. Owner, whether that be an individual or a kind of role within the business. And certainly the context, I think, is always really important, because quite often particularly in the projects I've been involved with, they generally would have been waterfall, they're quite long projects. Usually you get a change of business people, you get a change of project sponsor quite often in between the start and the end of the project. So capturing that context, which often then leads to sort of the business prioritization decision, is key, because people will move on, and if that context is lost, people might think, oh, maybe that's not as important as it was kind of agreed at the outset, and it could get kind of downgraded unintentionally, things like that. So it's quite important one from our side.
That context you mentioned, Chris, do you tend to reflect that as like through the associated process or features or some other means?
I guess kind of where it's come from, and usually capturing some stuff around how we're doing that now, if it's something that already exists, or kind of some thoughts on what we'd like from it if it's a new feature or capability that we're looking at implementing.
Gotcha. Thank you very much. And Lungile, your view on that one, please, for that question.
Yes, and very much so to Peter and Chris's point. I think two things that for me really will still stand out as the key elements when we're looking at clarification. Are the requirements giving that clarity? Because the requirement might be more clear on the end user, but is it clear to the business analyst, and to the other stakeholders who might be impacted by the same requirement? So clarity plays a very important role. And I also look at the relevancy of the requirement, because we must remember that requirements have got a lifespan as well. And how do they therefore remain relevant throughout the development life cycle? So definitely, I look at is it clear enough for both sides, be it the end user, be it the stakeholders, be it the BA or whomsoever who's playing that role at that time. And definitely they have to be relevant. They have to be relevant to the solution that we are working on, or they must also just be relevant to the problem that we are trying to address. So adding on to what has already been said, so clarity and relevancy, very key.
Excellent, thank you, Lungile. And I think, you've all three of you done an excellent job explaining what a requirement, the key elements are. I think probably only other things I might add that sometimes useful or often useful. I think having a clearly defined title can be quite an efficient way of being able to trawl through the requirements and identify them without having to read through the description of each of them. I think other than that, you've probably covered most of the elements from unique identifiers and priorities. Possibly it's worth as well exploring the rationale, I would say, depending on the type of requirement. Is normally helpful to back up the priority, which Chris mentioned a little while ago as well. But yeah, I won't waffle on and repeat what you've said, because it's all perfectly relevant. I wonder then, Chris, what is your approach, by sharing in terms of defining requirements, please?
So I guess we use a couple of different methods. Sometimes it's like looking at a use case approach, sometimes it would be a user story approach, and sometimes it'd be sort of a traditional business requirements sort of catalog or workbook type approach. So very much sort of Excel, lots of lines in a spreadsheet type approach. Usually a combination of all of them to some extent, depending on the project that we're working on, and generally recognizing that kind of requirements workbook builds on some of the user story type things that might we always talk about them as being placeholders for a conversation, but not necessarily getting down into the detail. And that those user stories often don't capture a lot of the non-functional requirements as well that are associated with projects. So they tend to come out of the back office, if you like. So not always captured as part of the user stories.
Gotcha. Yeah, and but just by exploring those three different types, use cases, user stories, and requirements, like I said, in a slightly different order than you, it obviously shows that there's different levels of granularity you want to try and share. I guess starting with the use cases, that almost like contextualizes the high level objectives in which you dive in deeper and explore the business requirements and the user stories, I think, as you just said. Yeah, so thanks for that, Chris. Peter, Lungile next, if you don't mind. What's your view on that?
So John, I come from a banking background, right? And most of our projects that we touch different stakeholders in terms of sometimes we are looking at our internal customers, sometimes it's our external customers. So really it depends with the targeted stakeholder. But yes, mostly it's definitely your user stories. We've got user story ways of asking questions and documenting. And that I find that it gives us more details. So it's definitely user stories. I do also actually I advocate for a lot of process walkthrough, right? Because some of these things are not well picked up when you're reading through procedure manuals or documents that you may have been given. So, process walkthroughs, I am able to interact with the end users and I'm able to see, as in like an over the shoulder desktop experience. But documenting and really putting together the insights, we definitely use the user stories, and we have different templates for different capturing of user stories. So it will be the process walkthrough, over shoulder workshops, or just shadowing someone, and definitely user stories as well.
Excellent, thank you. I think, Chris, you wouldn't mind putting yourself on mute. I think I can hear the machine whirring away in the background. That's it. It is what I can hear. Perfect. Well, we'll give you the thumbs up, Chris, when it's time to enter in. But by all means, unmute yourself if you've got something to interject with for sure. So thank you, Lungile, on that. Yes, so definitely, I think interesting talking about templates as well. So certainly, and of course, obviously user stories, which is aligned to what Chris was talking about. Peter, your view on requirements and how you approach defining them, please.
Thank you very much. So I think that is one question again, or one area of discussion that I think is very broad, because regularly we tend to, in my organization and in my previous roles, we tend to follow the regular approach of workshops, interview, and all those sorts of stuff. But it's what we really do within the workshops and the interviews that sort of makes those differences. Because for example, when I go into a workshop for eliciting requirements, for example, and I go into a workshop where I'm trying to validate requirements, the approach is sometimes different because of the preparation that I go through. So what I normally do when we're going for the elicitation workshops scenario, we're trying to look at the stakeholders that we have identified for that sort of workshop and design the materials that we that will create that mutual understanding between ourselves and the stakeholders. And just recently here, I had to go back to design a business model canvas for an organization that I was working on their program, just because the stakeholders that were going to come for that workshop were senior stakeholders, and we wanted to take them back to the history of the organization for them to understand the communication channels that were between it and how their revenues were coming, because we're trying to design a system that is not just a system that is the software. We're trying to design a system that comprises of how the organization would function, because we're going to register it as a new legal entity. So we talk about the data, all of the HR. So these are several sort of requirements that we're going to be involved with different segment of stakeholders, talking about HRO, payroll, and all of those stuff. But we need to understand the connection, the architecture in the whole of the organization. So those sort of diagrams kind of brings the understanding between the stakeholders you're communicating with. And when you get those sort of high-level requirements from those workshops, and you're able to document those documents and reference them, or give them unique reference numbers properly, you are able to use them to draft further requirements with referencing those initial documents that you've created in agreement with the stakeholders. So that is one core approach that we use most of the times.
And of course, that question is so broad that everyone will have a slightly different answer, understandably. But it's quite interesting to talk about, here, what Chris was saying about the different levels of requirement, and then what you're saying as well about the importance to link them up and show that traceability to the broader context and to other things that have been discussed as well, like scope, I think, as you mentioned there as well. So, yeah, it's definitely some interesting points there, Peter. So thank you. I think as it is such a broad topic, I'm not going to sort of start pouring out loads of different ideas as well, as I have had the benefit of writing the question, so I've had a little bit of time to prepare. But I think for me, I think the thing that I would add is that, I guess, my approach to defining requirements, whether they are for a waterfall or for a truly agile project, is somewhat similar, actually, to try and take an iterative approach to creating and defining the requirements. So as an example, I will, in the first instance, as I'm hearing about a need or requirement, whether it's business, functional, or a different level, then what I'm trying to do first is to get it on the page as quick as I can, so that we can start to see how I've interpreted that information, or perhaps how I've combined the information from several perspectives into a statement. So once we've got it on paper, then we can try and review it with the different stakeholders to determine, have I made the right interpretation? And to also think about those other important things you all mentioned as well, as to, once it's on the page, how can we link it through the IDs, which I think Chris mentioned, to the other artifacts that we're working on to try and prove that legitimacy. But it's very much, then an iterative cycle till we get to a point where actually we're comfortable that, all those smart characteristics that Chris outlined and more are all lined up, and we're happy with the quality of it, so that it's clear and understandable, which goes back to Ngile's point as well. Yeah. So I appreciate your answers there, folks. So I guess, Lungile, it'd be interesting to know how you ensure that your requirements are clear and as accurate and as unambiguous as possible, if you don't mind.
Wow, John, I think for me, really, we need to use simple language, right? For me, that's the first things first. Not complicating things. Yes, sometimes you find that requirements are of a business solution that touches a lot on tech. But for me, really looking at using simple language and visuals tend to work even more better when you look at putting together a prototype and models, right? Sometimes to get requirements to be clear, you could do a context diagram. You could actually draw what you believe or what you understood the requirements are. And by so doing, you are not only documenting just the wording of those requirements, but you're also showing a picture and the flow of how do these requirements flow in terms of where the project or the system or the phase is at. And also just using simple language, because there is nothing as ambiguous as coming up with all these other fancy words that we use that may not make sense to your stakeholders. So definitely stick to a simple language. And it's also important to look at the formatting. How do you format these requirements? If you're going to be sharing your requirements with really a sponsor, is it worthwhile writing paragraphs and so forth? Or would you rather have bullet points as to this is what you've understood the requirements to be? So I would really lean more on having simple language, use visuals or context diagrams to show your current requirements, and also really just be more format the requirements to suit your audience.
Excellent. Yeah, no, very thorough answer there. Good, thank you. Peter?
All right, thank you very much, and thank you, Lungile, for that. So using the context diagrams and also adapting to what Chris said earlier about use case diagrams. So it's really, really key to understand the place of pictures. They say the picture is what it has always, the places of images in our requirements. But going further to that is the fact that making sure that, sometimes when we are eliciting requirements, we tend to sometimes really use those ambiguous languages like user-friendly, since something you can't really put a measure on. So sometimes, just like when you say and, or you're using combination words, for example, it tends to make the requirements very, very unmeasurable. See if there's anything like unmeasurable, because it's just so big. So it's rather important that when you're demonstrating or you're writing down requirements, you make sure that the requirement is coined into one piece. So the set of words you use to coin it into one piece makes it a proper requirement, because then you could say it's measurable instead of going to say user-friendly and or in those sort of things, because when you say and, for instance, it's become two requirements already, and then it's no longer single enough for one piece of so it could be linear or even agile, but at the end of the day, you want to make sure that your requirement is singular enough for a stakeholder to understand, and when you're referencing them, you're able to say this requirement has this unique reference number, so it's unique to that sort of reference, and you don't want a situation whereby that requirement is divided in the future and you are unable to trace it to the initial source. So that is how sometimes I think I would like to make my requirements very clear and make sure that they are also traceable to their initial source from where they've come from. It could be an individual, it could be a document, that sort of approach.
Excellent, thank you, Peter. And Chris?
Can you hear me okay, John?
Yeah, got you.
Yeah. You just repeat the question, because it's quite a broad topic.
Yeah,
and
so
I want to make sure
how
I'm
do you
answering
ensure requirements you capture a clear, concise and unambiguous?
Okay. So just to touch on sort of what Lungile said at the beginning, I think making sure that you remove any of the business jargon from the requirements, and particularly making sure that if you've got any acronyms, that they're fully spelled out so that people don't misinterpret them. Quite often, three-letter acronyms have got multiple meanings depending on whereabouts you sit in the business. It can really get people off to a bad start if everybody sat there thinking that it all means something different. But one of the first things I'd say, I'll try and keep them very short and to the point. So if you're quite often, I see people add a lot of context into the actual requirements. I try and break that out, keep that separate so the requirement stands alone, and the context or any additional information about how things are done today or anything like that is done in the future. And then depending on how close I am to the project, because I used to work in the business before myself, so some areas of business I've got a lot of knowledge of, and that can be good and bad. In other areas I've got no knowledge at all, and again that can be good and bad as well. So quite often seeking out a peer review from a colleague just to say, you've got nothing to do with this project, no interest in it, you haven't got any stakes in it, can you just go through, make sure there's nothing in there that looks like it could be contentious or duplicate or kind of seems to contradict something else. I suppose thinking back on the recent assist session that we had down in London, thinking going forwards, could we start to apply some AI tools in this space to sort of go through and work out if there's any duplication or potential duplication in there or something that contradicts
Yeah, I
Very
think
good.
that AI assistance could be very useful to tie some of those things together. But certainly what you said there, Chris, well, I think it's sort of, with culminating in the peer reviews as well, sort of is the, combine a lot of things that Mnguni and Peter were saying as well in terms of, making it, further, more practical way of improving the quality of those requirements, and I think they both made the point around making the requirements atomic, thinking about who your audience is and trying to make it as easy for them to digest the information and the requirements as possible, which obviously goes back to the point, or relates to the point you made of removing that context and not clogging up the requirement with loads of additional text that somebody needs to then read, and it's probably unnecessary, which probably then helps the traceability as well. So I think, in short, there's not too much more I can add to that. I mean, I think the only thing I might add to it is around the reviews, which are of course important. But I know, Chris, you mentioned the peer reviews. I think it's often really handy and useful as well to conduct your reviews with the individuals, like on an informal basis that you're gathering the requirements from. So as I'm gathering a requirement, understanding it, I'll define it, share it with my stakeholder, whether verbally or written, straight away, to see if I've understood the full complexity and full level of the an impact of the requirement. Beyond that, I might seek other informal reviews as well as the peer reviews that you might do from those others not involved in the requirements, to make sure the requirements are understandable. And we should as well go into more formal reviews, probably culminating in sign-offs as appropriate anyway. So I think they're all good ways to measure the requirement quality, as it were. I think one last thing I sort of tended to do in the past as well is to have almost like a requirements quality checklist. Is something that can be quite effective, so that, irrespective of who's doing the review or possibly the peer review, we can make sure that we're thinking about, is it concise, is it atomic, is it traceable, and all those other good things that the three of you have mentioned already. But I think that's all I would add. I wonder then, just perhaps we can talk about some of the common challenges that you've come across in defining requirements. And I wonder, Peter, I'll start with you first on that one.
Thank you very much. So I think, like I said before, it's all sort of reflects on when you're writing down requirements, or you're kind of interviewing stakeholders, or you're in a workshop, you hear people use those ambiguous languages like friendly, user-friendly, fast, slow, for example, things like that. Those sort of languages is sort of the major challenge that as a business analyst I face when dealing with stakeholders or trying to elicit requirements. And the only way around this I've seen all this while, or the major way I've seen, is sort of should I say it's not, I wouldn't use the word teaching, but it's providing examples. Like, you come in with a lot of examples on the sort of requirement or the way you want those requirements to be framed. Sometimes I go into, maybe if it's on a one-on-one interview, I go in for the meeting with a spreadsheet where I've got like a requirement catalog, and I've got maybe so many columns hidden, the ones that are probably not relevant to that stakeholder. So I don't scare them away with a very large spreadsheet, that sort of thing. So I think providing that sort of context and example of what the requirement should look like, or maybe sometimes even writing some from maybe documents or other artifacts that you've previously documented or made, sort of helps in that process.
It makes me think, Peter, and this will come on to a topic we'll talk about later in terms of reusable requirements, but definitely makes me think as you're identifying requirements that you would consider, good ones that almost set the standard, to try and identify those, so that when you're sharing with stakeholders what you'd consider to be a good example, then you have those examples to hand already.
Yeah, true. Very true.
That's for sure. All right, no, brilliant, thank you. And I think as well, just having examples, as you said, not just for the requirement, but actually for the statements. Because I think you said, how do you make things measurable? When they talk about user friendly or fast. And I think we as BA, we can always ask sort of questions to almost challenge the stakeholders. So if someone says, I need this dashboard to be fast, we can say to them, so is it acceptable that actually it refreshes the data in 2 weeks' time? And possibly they'll say no. And if they say no, then what is acceptable? Maybe that's the way to ask. Certainly for some of the non-functionals or some of the performance level requirements, to try and find what is unacceptable in terms of the requirement, to ultimately find what they would be their measure of success.
Yeah, true.
And Chris, what will be your perspective on the question around common challenges?
I'd say for my area, I work with a lot of business subject matter experts who write requirements for control systems as part of their day-to-day jobs. So you talked, John, about getting kind of a placeholder in and doing iterations around a requirement. Quite often we can spend a lot of time going down a bit of a rabbit hole, getting really finessing the words around a particular requirement, and you can be an hour into a workshop and you've kind of got 1-2 requirements written down. It can be a bit soul destroying for the people in there. So trying to get to that position where we start to get some themes in and some high level requirements, and then maybe go back and put in the detail, or we have sub level requirements under those high level requirements, is something that I found worked quite well, really, to get the sort of balance between getting into a level of detail that engages the people you're trying to get the information out of, without being too hung up on things.
Yeah, and I mean that's a really well made point, because it actually reminds me of something someone raised probably a few BAInsights sessions ago about. This wasn't the term they used, but it was almost like requirements fatigue amongst the stakeholders.
Yeah.
In that you don't want them spending if you can help it, you want to try and get to the point where you're trying to help them and figure out solutions as quick as you can. Now, obviously, you do need to ask them about their current state and what the requirements are, but trying to make that as painless as possible is almost certainly the right way forward. So, in the example you're outlining there, I think is a really good one. Particularly around workshops, we've got a number of different people with different perspectives, to just try and get the high level, figure out who it is you need to speak to before going away in detail and figuring it out with them. Yeah,
certainly another one that's quite difficult is, and Peter made a good point around, so somebody asks for something to be fast. What is fast? So quite often we try and put a definition around how quickly we want a web page to open, from a user clicking on it, for example. But then it gets very sort of into the realms of, well, it depends what spec machine you're doing it on and what your internet connection's like, and how do you test the end-to-end of that requirement. And it almost becomes kind of irrelevant to some extent, really, because there's so many unknowns that are outside of the scope of the people who are delivering the software. Let's say if it's a software deliverable, it does get quite hard to sort of test. So then you sort of get back into that, well, instead of being exact and prescriptive around a number, what feels acceptable, and then but then is that testable? And you sort of find yourself flicking between the two all the time, just wanting to put a number on it, and you can hold people to ransom over that, and then being too prescriptive and having to sort of take a step back from it, because potentially you're never going to be able to validate that you've met that.
Yeah, that certainly makes me think as well about the solution, Chris, in terms of, I guess almost in that example, breaking it down into maybe a couple of parts of that. I don't want to call it a journey, but that interaction with the tool. If I'm honest, thinking about, is it something that you can segregate the environment, i.e. the systems or platforms which they're using, versus the functions that they're using as well. So an example that I've sometimes seen in the past is if people are trying to get like price level information that can change quite a lot. Might be equivalent to, like you can imagine the estate agents, like price of a flight moving from one place to another. That's going to have it's going to have a point where that price is going to run out. So you need your system to be able to present that price in enough time for someone to make a decision and lock it in before the price is lost, as an example. So it certainly makes me think about that scenario. But of course, as you said, we can't always control the environment or the internet speed that the person's using to make those connections. Excellent. And Lungile, your view on that question as well, if you would.
Thank you, John. So, talking about challenges, right? For me, I've noted that sometimes you inherit requirements which were incomplete, and now the previous people who were working on the requirements are no longer on the project. Now you're picking up, and a few things have changed. And now the stakeholders are not willing to sign off maybe now those requirements, because they're saying this is not what they actually initially agreed on, and things like that. So really inheriting requirements that are incomplete is one of the common challenges. And we often have to now decide, are we going to restart this job, or how are we going to tackle it? And another thing, definitely stakeholder alignment. Aligning with your stakeholders is very key. So as a result, as much as you don't want to bombard them with information, to Chris's point, but you also want to keep them up to date, you need to remain on the same page with your stakeholders. So then you will have regular check-ins. Don't really have to be meetings all the time. Could be an email, could be a quick chat, for those people who go to the office, you could just meet up for coffee just to verify and keep checking that you are still within the same spec of requirements. So stakeholder alignment and inherited incomplete requirements, they are very much a common challenge in my space.
Thank you very much. And it makes me think there, as you're talking about that really there's that almost like that unwritten rule for the BA, that good practice to help maintain the relationships is not just define the requirements, but actually, while they might be being worked on, or they might be on the backlog, or they might not be allocated yet to development, just touching base, keeping connected to your stakeholders, letting them
100%.
know how things are going on. Yeah, really, really excellent point. And it shows that when we think about defining requirements, it's not just about how to write the words on the page, it's thinking about all come with it.
Yeah. No, 100%, John. And because the requirements themselves, they've got like a lifespan. So throughout that lifespan, you need to ensure and keep checking in if you are still within you're still on the same page with your stakeholders. Yeah.
And I mean, I can definitely relate to that for sure. And I think that sort of it ties back nicely with what Chris was saying earlier on about the use cases, thinking about the business requirements, and then the user stories in terms of, if we know that we have a view of the context through the use cases, and then as we start to explore the more cases and define some of the high level requirements, there's not necessarily the imperative to go and define loads of detailed stories until someone's actually available or allocated to start working on the solutions. And at that point, hopefully, if we can deliver the requirements just in time, the stories just in time, an example, then it limits the opportunity for them to go out of date and have to go back run the cycle again. Yeah, I mean, excellent. I mean, and really, you've probably covered all of the things I had noted down as well in terms of common challenges. I think the only thing additionally, therefore, that springs to mind off the top of my head is, I think what can be a little bit of a distraction sometimes is when you're the business analyst, particularly if you've got a lot of stakeholders or a lot of analysis that's been done. There's invariably those situations where your stakeholder will approach you and ask for status updates, ask for where requirements are, whether you've recorded it, and a whole bunch of information. And any of that, whilst it's a good way to maintain relationship with the stakeholders, is sometimes a distraction from the more detailed analysis that you might be doing at that point. So as such, I think it's always worked out quite useful for me is as I'm defining the requirements, not just think about where I'm giving them to in order for them to be resolved, but how I can reflect those requirements along with any context and make it accessible to all my stakeholders so they have the ability to review it, to see, maybe if they want to change their mind, they can see the requirements, or at the very least, they can see how those requirements are working their way towards a solution, if they wish, anyway. I think that's all there is for me to say. So I think on top of that, I think it's probably time now to talk about the concept of reusable requirements. And but I'd like to get your thoughts, Chris, on the concept of a reusable requirement, if you don't mind, please.
Yeah, it's something we do a lot in the business. I wouldn't say we tend to do it so well on the IT side. So we've got a lot of prompts around requirements, particularly in the non-functional space. So it's almost like a checklist, sort of saying, have you considered the performance aspects, security aspects, user aspects of identity and access management and things like that, and thought about what you're going to do in that space. But it's not something where we've got a requirement that we can lift and shift from another project and just kind of top and tail it or something like that. It is literally sort of placeholders for conversations, and a bit more elaboration around what we would be discussing in that space with the business stakeholders. But interestingly, when we're looking at more of a product focus on the business side, as we move from developing one product to the next, we'll quite often take a whole host of product requirements and use them as a starting point for the next project as well. So as a business, company, just to differentiate between business and company, we've got a lot of experience of doing it, but it's not something that we tend to do a lot of on the IT side, my experience.
Gotcha. And I mean, you bring up files as well, non-functional requirements. I think it's probably the most logical example for me, I think, to think about a reusable. But then you're also saying that there's different levels, I think, of those requirements. I think, having that high level view of the fact you need to think about scalability and security and the things you mentioned before, maybe on each project, drilling into specifically what are the individual requirements for that product in terms of performance, is a step that we might not be able to reuse the requirement for. So yes, I certainly appreciate what you said there, Chris.
I'd say historically in my organisation as well, it's around what we do with the output of stuff after a project. So does it live in Excel spreadsheets on people's, personal machines? Does it go into a forum pass shared area? And we're trying to get better at putting stuff into Azure DevOps as somewhere to capture requirements now, which obviously makes collaboration a lot easier, but it also makes kind of extracting requirements and putting them into future projects a lot easier as well. If somebody's doing a fantastic piece of work and that kind of has ended up stuck on their D drive or something like that on the machine, obviously nobody else is ever going to get visibility of that output. So you've got a lot of good work and time and effort that's gone into something that's not necessarily going to get used again.
That's it.
So a lot about document storage, I think, as well plays sort of into this sort of thing.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense as well, because I mean, if you can't access the requirement, then you've got no ability to tell whether you want to reuse it or not. So yeah, very, very valid point. Sure. Lungile, what would be your view on reusable requirements, if you would?
So with reusable requirements, we look at the quality of those requirements. Has anything changed over time? And also the projects, what is the project scope? Is it something similar to what we needed those requirements for previously? If yes, and definitely, then we need to also look at how relevant are these requirements in the now, in the current state, and then we are able to say, we can go ahead and reuse those requirements, especially in projects where we maybe standardizing processes and we have done it previously. We can definitely look at reusing those. So quality will stand out for me. The quality of those requirements, and also are they now still relevant to the solution that we're working on now? And if so, and if it ticks those boxes, definitely we should be. And if those requirements talk to being efficient for this current project or process that we are working on now, definitely we will look at reusing those. And that is if we can find them, because also repositories and storing of information, you know, we more on the consulting basis right now. And when people leave the organization, sometimes we don't know the work that Chris was working on, where was that saved, you know? So it also plays a role as to, can we get the requirements from where they were stored, and we can see the life cycle of those requirements, how efficient are they, and if we can reuse them. So definitely we can reuse requirements.
Excellent, thank you, Lungile. And Peter, your view.
Thank you very much, Chris. So with regards to reusable requirements, so from the word reusable, it just kind of spells out that it's something you've used before, you want to reuse it again. So for example, in my organization, we have multiple, in my team, we have multiple, or let's say multiple 3 streams of programs we're working on. And when it comes to template, which are sort of requirements on the business side of things, you see how easy for us using the same sort of, like we've got postcard templates, we've got risk register. You see how we're using this sort of templates from one program to the other, and the templates are always very useful. Sometimes you see that it kind of makes it easy for us to link them together. Then on the side of non-functional requirements, you see that when you're dealing with policies within the organizations, like here in the UK, we're concerned about GDPR, for example. And I mentioned earlier, I was working on HRO system, payroll system, finance systems. You see that these sort of systems are linked to the GDPR policy. So those sort of requirements could be 6 years within the organization. Sometimes in some organizations, 7 years. They are uniform. So what is the point of trying to write requirements that align to that policy in multiple places when you could actually adopt them from the previous requirements catalog you've created? So that sort of things, it also goes further to when you're doing even the functional requirements, because sometimes, especially when you're going for outsourced company, when you're outsourcing some software, for example, like we use an outsourced HR system. Obviously, the requirements on that system was different from the in-house HR system. So the login functionality, for example, I wasn't there when that was created, but I'm assuming it will be similar, which is another example of having a reusable requirement. And the examples are numerous if there was time to just keep going and go, I believe.
Yeah, that's fair. And I mean, I think based on what you said as well, I mean, it reminds me of something where I was working on requirements that were potentially reusable at some point in the past, and the way we sort of manage those requirements is that we'd first flag a requirement as being appropriate for reuse, and then if we flag the requirement as appropriate for reuse, then it'd be something that you could then access in order to reuse it should you wish. And I think that goes back definitely to tooling. You need the ability for the tool to be able to flag a requirement as reusable, and then to almost clone it if you choose to reuse it, so that you can then affiliate that requirement to maybe a new initiative or a new project as well. So that's so it was certainly beneficial in those cases to be able to do that, and as well as all the things you all mentioned as well. I'm conscious of the time, so I don't want to keep you too long, as we've committed to a certain amount of time. So maybe we'll draw things to a close at that point, as we've sort of talked about requirements definition in a fair amount of detail, and introduced the concept of usable requirements as well. So it feels like a good place to take a pause. So with that being the case, I think the only thing I do need to do is just to thank you all for your time and for your insight. And if anyone's enjoyed watching this, to drop a like or any comments as well. And we'll look forward to hearing from you and speaking to the 3 of you in the future.
Thank you very much for having me on this program.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.